So just to give you a little bit of background about me, I am an extension beef cattle specialist here at the University of Tennessee. My background is in beef nutrition, but also in grazing management. So I focus on that nutrition from a forages perspective. And so I'm really excited to follow up the talk about forage analyses that you had last time, and talk a little bit about mineral nutrition tonight. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump right into it. First, let's just talk about what minerals are. Often because they're such a small part of the diet, they are kind of overlooked or they're not thought about very much. And so these are naturally occurring inorganic elements, meaning that they occur in the earth, and they don't have carbon associated with them. And they're essential for many different functions in the body. And so we don't think of them specifically as, like an energy or water or protein, some of those bigger building blocks, but they do act as a supportive role in all of the functions that the body does. And so any kind of bone development, any mechanisms behind immune function, muscle function, they're really important in all of those roles. And it's important to remember that they're not synthesized by the body. And so we have to supply them in the diet. And most of the time that looks like supplying them in the form of a mineral supplement. So something outside of the typical forages and feeds that they would be eating. And so what minerals are not is a fix for poor nutrition and management. And so a lot of times we might see some nutritional challenges or even just overall management challenges. And somebody puts out a new mineral and they think this will fix the problem. But really, we have to think about the whole approach. What does the whole nutrition program look like? And this is certainly a key part of that, but it's not going to be a fix-all in your nutrition program. And then I saw a presentation recently where another beef nutritionist said that they're not pixie dust. So I thought that was kind of neat to remember. There's something, again, that's important, but they're not going to fix everything. And so we've got a figure here that shows kind of the building blocks behind nutrition. We think about those big, like I said, energy sources, carbs, proteins, those building blocks of muscle, and enzymes are kind of like the mortar in between those bricks. So the bricks are really the big heavy hitters, but the mortar is what holds that together and kind of fills in the gaps in between some of those bigger nutrients. And so again, they're very important. All of our immune function and reproductive management, all of this depends on making sure that cattle have the proper nutrients that they need, specifically in the form of minerals. So where do typically we see minerals coming from in the diet? I've got a list here, and I don't want you to focus too much on what the significant functions are. But see that there's a variety of them, and we have a lot of different minerals that we have to think about. And so within these different types of sources, we get different mineral concentrations. So you'll see that our forages, which is going to be the majority of our cattle diets, are going to provide some of those nutrients. Grains also have some of those nutrients as well. I want you to specifically look there at calcium and phosphorus. And see that forages have a lot of calcium and grains have a lot of phosphorus. And we'll talk about that and why that's important in just a little bit. Specifically, magnesium is one that typically does not occur in any of the forages or feeds that cattle eat. And we'll talk about the implications of that and what that magnesium supplement looks like, especially during certain times of the year. And so you see there's just a mixture there of where those minerals come from in the diet. And we also have to remember that water can be a source of minerals. And it's not typically a source that we depend on to deliver enough minerals to cattle, but it can actually have some minerals in it that are a little bit problematic. So they can create some negative interactions if things like iron or sulfur are too high in that water. And even salt. We have to think about salt as an intake limiter. And so if we live in a location where salt is very high in the water, then we want to think about that when we think about how we formulate a mineral supplement, because it will affect their intake. So minerals can be a complex topic. When I went to grad school and I, said I'm going to be a scientist, I thought that science was pretty black and white. But it turns out that when you choose two living organisms, so forages and cattle, and put them together, and then depend on the weather to also influence it, it gets to be a little bit more complex. And so, specifically thinking about minerals, the availability of minerals in forages will fluctuate, and that depends on a lot of different factors. So, the season, what time of year it is, whether it's cool outside or warm, if we're having a lot of moisture, or if we're in a drought condition, what the mineral concentration of the soil is. So if that soil has been fertilized or if it has naturally occurring minerals in it, the forage species, so whether it's a cool or a warm season forage, an annual or a perennial, and specifically a legume or a grass is really going to influence the mineral availability in that forage. And then finally, plant maturity. I'm sure that you talked about this in your last webinar when you talked about forage analysis. That plant maturity is really the number one factor in the nutritive value of that forage. And so we can imagine that that would also be the case for the availability of the minerals in that forage, especially if it's pretty mature. So not only do we have a lot of fluctuations with that forage component or that feed component, we also have fluctuations based on growth and stage of production. So if we have a growing calf, like a stocker animal, then those mineral requirements are going to be very different than a lactating cow, not only because of their growth rate, but also the demands of lactation versus just growth itself. And so we have to think about, again, what stage of production our cattle are in, and also thinking about calving season and how that affects the nutrition needs of our cattle. And so if we have a pretty tight calving season or a tight calving window, that allows us to tailor the nutrition program a little bit more closely to the stage of production that our cows are in. And so with that, we can tailor our mineral supplementation to that as well, making sure that, if all the cows are in peak lactation, our mineral is going to meet the requirements during peak lactation. And then maybe we change that throughout the year, depending on, again, their stage of production and how that fluctuates. So we often supplement at the level that is required for each of these minerals. So we can take into account the minerals that are in the diet. We can take a forage analysis and see what the mineral content is. But because it fluctuates so much, we do typically see our mineral supplements formulated to just meet the requirement of the animal. So we don't want to rely on some of that fluctuating value in that forage. So we just go ahead and make mineral supplements that will meet the requirement regardless of what the diet is. We typically don't run into many toxicity issues that way because there are only a few minerals that really can cause that kind of issue. So we just go ahead and take care of it in the mineral supplement itself. So let's talk about macro versus micro minerals. You may hear them called this, or you may hear macro minerals and trace minerals. And basically, this just has to do with the amounts that are required in the body, how they're represented on the feed tag as far as the concentration in the mineral supplement, and then where they're stored in the body. And so for our macro minerals, these are the larger components, so the ones that are needed in larger amounts, which means greater than 100 milligrams. That's going to be on a per day. And so that's going to be represented as a percentage of the diet. When we talk about tags in a minute, we'll see calcium, 6 to 12%. And so that's one of our macro minerals that's presented as a larger amount of that mineral supplement. Our micro minerals, on the other hand, are required in smaller amounts, and they're only going to be represented in parts per million or milligrams per kilogram, which is an equivalent of parts per million. And so these are going to be pretty specific formulations. They're tough to get mixed, and that's why we rely on mineral mixers or mineral dealers to do that and make sure that they're formulated correctly, because it is tough to deliver some of these micro minerals just as themselves and not as a mix. And so just to mention where these are stored in the body, those macro minerals are typically going to be the building blocks of their skeletal system. And so they're stored in the bone. And because they're stored in the bone, they're not easily mobilized, which means we need to make sure that we're providing these consistently every day, so that that animal has those nutrients to pull from. So they have calcium, they have phosphorus, because they can't pull those from the stores in their body as easily as they can the microminerals. So with the microminerals, those are typically stored in the liver. And the liver, that tissue makes it easier for those minerals to be mobilized. So if an animal is in a deficient state, they can pull from that liver tissue a little bit more easily. And we don't see that deficiency as quickly as we might from a macro mineral. So just to give you a list of what those are, and I've got their abbreviations or their symbols there. That's what I'm going to use throughout the rest of the presentation. But you'll see those macro minerals, calcium, phosphorus are really two big important ones. We'll talk about the ratio and why that's important. Potassium, sodium, and I don't have chloride next to it, but salt, magnesium, and sulfur. So thinking about, again, those things that make up a lot of the skeletal structure is what our macro minerals are. Our microminerals: copper, iron, manganese, zinc, cobalt, iodine, and selenium. And so we do see, sometimes either a deficiency or even an antagonism, which we'll talk about when we talk about mineral interactions. But these are, again, those minerals that are needed in smaller amounts. So when it comes to supplementation and what we actually need to provide in the diet, all of the minerals that are listed here in black, so the ones that are still black, are the ones that we need to provide for sure. Potassium, sulfur, and iron are typically in adequate amounts in the diet of cattle, but they do end up being, included sometimes in these mineral mixes, but they're typically not a problem that we have to focus on. Sulfur specifically, at least here in Tennessee, we have a problem where high sulfur can create a copper deficiency. And so we don't want to add any more sulfur to the diets of our cattle because they already get a good bit of sulfur in their diet from the forages that we have here. And that may be the case in Maryland. I'm not exactly sure, but that antagonism would be the same. And so if there is high sulfur in the diet, that can create a problem with copper. And so that's something that we don't want to add to the diet if we don't have to. So I've already kind of mentioned this when I talked about what minerals do in the body and where they come from in the diet with that chart that we looked at. But just as a reminder, I've got a list here of what several of these minerals do and kind of their overarching function. So things like zinc, copper, selenium, magnesium, iron, and manganese all contribute to good health. And so we think a lot about those receiving calves or weaned calves, calves that are in a time of stress. So after they've been weaned and their immune system is stressed, really making sure that they have plenty of those microminerals is important. A huge list there that interacts with nutrient digestibility and metabolism. So how these animals break down the individual nutrients that they get from their diet. And so these may just be tiny pieces of the mechanism that leads to digestibility, but depending on what those mineral concentrations are, the diet can be used efficiently or it may not be. And so they all play a role in that. I mentioned skeletal growth. So what our bones are typically made of, calcium is what we really think of, or, we drink milk for strong bones. So that's kind of the big hitter there. And then muscle growth, thinking about copper, zinc, and selenium. So just again, those overarching things: health, nutrition, and growth. And what's really important about these different things is all of this influences the economically important traits that we look for in beef production. And so whether we're a cow-calf operator, whether we're developing heifers or raising stocker calves, we have some kind of end product in mind. And even if we're finishing out some cattle. And so the traits that we look at, and this is just a few examples: calf crop, weaning weight, average daily gain, and carcass merit, are all going to be influenced by their nutrition, their health, and their growth. And so even these tiny parts of the diet can have a big influence on what we're selling essentially at the end of the day. So why do we need to supplement? Why do we need to actually formulate a mineral supplement and provide that outside of their typical diet? What you see here is a table that's got just some of the minerals up top. So some of those big minerals that I named, calcium here, and then all the way across the table. And then below that is the requirement in the diet for what a growing calf would require. So that is the amount of each of those minerals that a growing calf would require every day in their diet. And then there's a list here below that of just some common feedstuffs, feeds that we would typically see in cattle diets, and the amount of each of those minerals that's in that particular feedstuff. And so you'll notice that if you just look in general, there's a lot of red numbers here. And everywhere that there's a red number, that means that feedstuff is deficient for that particular mineral. And so we see overall that there are going to be some deficiencies in the diet, regardless kind of what that animal is eating. And so again, it's like an insurance policy. We go ahead and provide that supplement at the mineral requirement. Even though there might be some in the diet, there's likely a deficiency somewhere. And so we want to go ahead and include that as the supplement form. So what are some of those forms or different methods that we can use to supplement? There's different kind of delivery methods, if you will. So minerals can be in the form of a block. They can be free choice. They can be mixed into a TMR or top dressed into a feed that's in a feed bunk. And there are also injectable mineral supplements. So we're going to break down each one of these and kind of talk about the pros and cons of those. So let's start with blocks. There are a lot of blocks out there on the market. There are different colors. There are all kinds to be sold. And intake with those blocks tends to be low. And so regardless of what particular trace mineral is in that block, cattle do not eat enough of that block because they have to lick and they don't tend to consume as much from a block form. And so regardless of what trace minerals are in there, they're probably not going to take in enough to actually get a benefit from it. And so you'll see some of these colored blocks that are enhanced with different types of mineral nutrients. But no matter which one of those it is, most likely they're not going to eat enough of it. The other thing to remember about blocks is sometimes we just see plain white salt blocks. And like I mentioned before, salt is actually an intake limiter. It's kind of a trade-off. So salt encourages consumption. We'll talk about that with free choice minerals, but it also limits intake at a certain point. And so when we think about providing a mineral mix, if we put that out there and we also provide salt separately, so if there's salt in our mineral mix and we have salt separately, more than likely they're just going to consume the salt because it tastes good. It's the only type of mineral that cattle really find palatable. And so they're going to consume that salt, which means they're not going to consume the mineral at the amount that we want them to. And that's going to create some of those deficiency challenges. And so if you're providing a free choice mineral, make sure that you're not also providing salt at the same time so that they don't start to cause that negative intake on one another. So with that, free choice minerals is really probably my favorite method of delivering minerals to cattle, especially on the pasture setting. It's pretty easy to go out there and pour a bag of mineral into a mineral feeder and leave it and check it every few days. And so these are easy for us, but they're kind of pre-formulated to match our environment and our management system. And they're typically formulated for a target intake of 2 to 4 ounces per head per day. So if we just did some rough math on that, a 50-pound bag will last 50 cows 4 to 5 days. And so we'll, think about what our herd size is and how often we need to refill those feeders. Now, they're not going to eat that much, maybe every day. Their intake will fluctuate, but that kind of gives us a target to think about, are they eating enough? Are they going through it pretty quickly? Are they going through it too quick? Or are they not eating it at all? And so we can think about that time frame to make sure that they're actually consuming it. And if they're not, try to find a more palatable option for them. And so to ensure that they eat the mineral, putting it near water or loafing areas, near areas that they tend to stay more often, to make sure that they're actually going to the feeder, they're curious about it, they're going in there and getting a taste, and then realizing that that salt is going to drive some intake. So making sure that they have easy access to it. And you'll notice that I have a picture here of one that's covered, so a mineral feeder that has a cover on it. There are some minerals that are free choice or loose that are formulated to be weather resistant, but if possible, it's best to keep them covered. And that's because if rain gets onto these minerals, those minerals go into solution and they're not as available to the animal at that point. So we do want to make sure that free choice mineral is protected from the weather, to make sure that we're getting the full availability of that mineral for our cattle. This is a question I get pretty often, and so I went ahead and put a slide in here about it. I get the question, if I provide minerals separately, so cafeteria style, like you see in the picture, will the cows eat what they need? And this is kind of an old wives' tale. You'll see there that there are a lot of different options for cattle to choose from, but they don't have nutritional wisdom like we do. And so there's a reason that there is salt in a free choice mineral mix. Again, it's to cause the animals to eat some of that mineral, because that salt is palatable to them. And so otherwise, if we don't have salt in there, minerals tend to be bitter or metallic, or they don't taste good. And you can imagine things that are, taste like metal are probably not something they're going to go and pick to eat first. And so when I talk about nutritional wisdom, if we were given the option as humans to eat a cheeseburger or a salad, we know which one is going to provide more nutrients for us. I say more nutrients, not calories, but we know which one maybe is the better nutritional option, right? But we can still choose the one that tastes better. And so cattle, they don't know which one is good for them, but they do know which ones taste better. So they're just going to eat the ones that taste good, and they're not going to eat as much of the ones that don't. And so the reason that that's so important is because there are a lot of mineral interactions. If you've seen this figure before, this is the mineral wheel. Sometimes you'll see it even with arrows inside all those lines. And basically for every line that's on that figure, there's an interaction between those two minerals. So one that's notable, like I mentioned earlier, is sulfur and copper. If there's too much sulfur in the diet, copper becomes less bioavailable. So even if there's copper there, it's tied up by the sulfur that's in the diet. And so with these different interactions, if we're relying on cattle to choose those minerals like they would in a cafeteria style, they're not going to choose a balance that's appropriate for their nutritional needs. And so a good mineral program really takes into account all of the needs and makes sure that that mineral is balanced between all of these different components. All right, another method of delivering minerals would be mixing it into feed or top dressing it. And so this is going to ensure adequate intake, a little bit more so than if we provided it free choice and just let cattle come get it off to the side. And so think about this the way you would a total mixed ration. If we have mineral that's in the feed or top dress on the feed, every time that animal takes a bite, they get minerals in that bite. And so we know that they're consuming it, especially if we have calves that are eating out of a bunk, and they're cleaning up that bunk every day. We know that they've eaten that mineral. And so if we're going to mix mineral into the feed, we need to know how much feed is being fed so that we can allocate enough of that mineral per head of animal that's eating out of the same area. And then if we're top dressing, this makes it a little bit easier. We can just weigh out the daily amount and pour that across the top of the feed trough. So a couple different options there in delivering it, especially in those animals that are fed out of a bunk. So, maybe stocker, backgrounder calves, or even folks that are finishing their animals. And so this is really helpful for those highly stressed calves, the ones that I said are, under stress because they've recently been weaned, or animals that we're bringing onto our farm, especially stocker and backgrounders, because they're under a high period of stress. And so we want to ensure that they're really getting that mineral nutrition during that time. to make sure their immune function stays strong. And so this can be a really helpful method for delivering to those types of animals. All right, the last one I want to talk about is injectable trace mineral. So there are some products out there that have multiple trace minerals in them. Typically, it's a mixture of copper, selenium, manganese, and zinc. And what we see in these is that it does improve trace mineral status either in the blood or in the liver shortly after it's delivered. And so there's a figure here. This was some work that was done in Iowa. And basically, they just compared a lot of different methods of delivering mineral to cattle. And you'll see in that first figure, kind of on the left there, right in the middle of the screen, that's the blood concentration or the plasma concentration of, I believe this was selenium in this case. And so what you see there, that top line is the injectable method. And so 8 hours post-injection, certainly there was an improvement, a higher amount of that selenium in the bloodstream. But you see that it drops very quickly within the first 2 days. After that injection, it goes to the typical levels that we would see in the blood and the levels that are the same as the other methods of mineral delivery. Now, if you look at the next figure there, the one on the right, that's the concentration of selenium in the liver for this particular study. And so within 2 days, that selenium moved out of the bloodstream and it moved into the liver where it could be stored. Like I mentioned, those trace minerals are stored in the liver for some amount of time. And so after that 2 days, it shows up in the liver as a pretty high concentration. So knowing that we've improved that mineral status again, but you see that rapid decline over time. Just, within the first couple of weeks, it's pretty well cleared that high amount out of the liver and is maintaining the typical levels that we would see with other methods. And so what that tells us is there is an improvement if we have an animal that's, that really we know there's a deficiency and we need to get a quick fix. These would be a type of supplement that would be helpful. But the body is going to maintain homeostasis. It's going to maintain a level that's kind of that just right, that Goldilocks, right? So once that animal's body recognizes that it doesn't need as much selenium that's in that liver in that early part of the injection phase, it's going to clear that out of the system through urine. And so a lot of times we see, if we're over delivering some of these supplements, they can be wasted essentially. So again, this would be something that would be used maybe for very specific health reasons. It does require a prescription, and there have been variable results on the actual performance measures that we look at. So the actual reproductive traits, the growth traits that we measure. So again, there can be an improvement in mineral status just shortly after that injection, but not something that we would use or depend on to be our typical mineral supplementation program. All right, let's talk about reading tags for a minute. So on a mineral tag, there's some things that are required to be on there. I've got a list here. You'll see the name, the product name. If there's any kind of medication in that product, it has to be on the label and what that product is used for. So this particular label here, it's for beef cattle on pasture. You'll see a guaranteed analysis. So the amounts or concentrations of minerals that are within this mineral supplement. The ingredient statement. Those ingredients are just like on our food labels. They're listed from largest amount to smallest amount. And then, instructions, and those can be anything as simple as provide 2 ounces per day, or even more specific like you see here. Any cautions or warning statements that are needed. So especially those minerals that are for cattle only, you want to make sure you don't feed those to sheep because of their copper levels. And so that copper is much higher in cattle diets than it is in sheep diets. And then also making sure that selenium is limited to 3 milligrams per day. And so just some caution or warning statements you might see on there. And then of course, how much mineral is actually in the bag. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about ingredients and what to look for on that. So the big thing to remember about the different sources or the different ingredients that go into a mineral supplement is bioavailability. And that is the degree to which a mineral becomes available after it enters into the tissue. And so it's important to know if there are deficiencies or antagonisms in the diet to really know if this bioavailability needs to be a huge focus. And so, of course, we want, to spend money on a mineral that is available to our cattle from a biological standpoint. But specifically thinking about, again, I'm going to go back to that copper and sulfur example. If there is a high sulfur diet, we want to feed a mineral supplement that has copper that's highly bioavailable, so that even if it starts to get tied up with that sulfur, there's more of a chance of that copper being absorbed by the animal. So we want to make sure that we know kind of what the soil and forage conditions are, as well as the animal, any issues that we may have with the animal and their diet, to make sure that we're focusing on the proper sources. And so there are several different types of minerals that you'll see in the ingredients. The first one is inorganic. So these are minerals exactly as they're mined out of the earth. So there's nothing that has been done to them. They don't contain carbon. And so you'll see those typically in the form of oxides or sulfates. And when it comes to bioavailability, oxides tend to be less bioavailable than sulfates. And so that's going to be probably our least expensive source of mineral, because it doesn't require any extra kind of work to get it to be more bioavailable. The next type is organic minerals or chelated minerals. You'll hear them called chelated sometimes. This basically means that the mineral has been paired with some carbon-containing molecule to make it more bioavailable. And I just want to note that an organic mineral is not necessarily USDA organic certified. It has to do truly with the chemistry and the chemical makeup of that mineral itself. So you'll see these minerals paired with amino acids, methionine or amino acid complex. Again, that's just a pairing to make them more bioavailable. There are also hydroxy minerals. Those are just a different formulation basically than the traditional inorganic, but they're also not organic. So just kind of some different options out there, not something that you necessarily need to get caught up on, but just to know that there are some different types of ingredients they can use to accomplish the same types of mixes for these mineral supplements. And so in general, inorganic are less bioavailable than organic or hydroxy minerals. And there is a cost difference there. So we'll talk about cost in a minute and when it's important maybe to go ahead and splurge on some of those chelated minerals. Something that we don't get from the tag is the proportion of each mineral coming from different sources. So this tag is the same one from the previous slide. And I know it's a little bit tough to see there, but there's an inorganic form and an organic form of zinc in there. So there's zinc oxide, there's zinc sulfate, and then there's also a zinc amino acid complex. And so basically what that tells us is, okay, there are different parts of this ingredient that have zinc in them. Is that a 50-50 blend? Is it a 90-10 blend? Am I getting more of the bioavailable ingredient, or am I getting more of the one that's maybe less bioavailable? And so that's something that your mineral dealer would be able to tell you, or should be able to tell you, maybe if they have to look into their records a little bit more. We also don't know the bioavailability of these sources. After obviously tonight's presentation, I hope that you do know a little bit more about sulfates and oxides like we just talked about, but that's not something that we get on the tag. And then finally, the concentration of minerals that are not in the guaranteed analysis. So we see that guaranteed analysis, we see the different minerals there, but in the ingredients, there are also other minerals that are named that are not in that guaranteed analysis. So they're in there in some concentration. We just don't know what that concentration is. So we can only rely on that guaranteed analysis to tell us exactly what is in this mineral supplement. So this is a pretty general table. I just just wanted to pull this up as an example, certainly not anything that you would need to memorize, but just an example of a mineral for beef cows on fescue. This is what we typically have here in Tennessee, and even on up into the northern part of the US, we see these cool season forages, so it would be similar there as well. And so we really see calcium and phosphorus as the big kind of two ingredients first. And then from there, we start seeing some of the smaller amounts and even our trace minerals. And so you'll see a difference here based on intake per head per day, or that's projected intake. So we typically want animals to eat 2 to 4 ounces of that mineral. If it's formulated for them to eat 4 ounces, it's going to be more concentrated, meaning there's a lower percentage of each of those ingredients. If we only want them to eat 2%, I think I said that backwards. If we only want them to eat 2% of, all right, I'm going to start over. If we only want them to eat 2 ounces of that mineral, then there's going to be a higher concentration of those nutrients. I got myself confused there. So if they're going to eat a lower amount, there's higher concentrations. If we want them to eat a higher amount of that mineral, then there's lower concentrations. So it ends up being about the same amount of intake, but it can be influenced by if our cattle are truly willing to eat that much. So in a 4-ounce mineral, they're going to need to consume more. And if we see that they're not consuming enough, then maybe we change that mineral to make sure they're eating the recommended amount. All right, quickly, I want to talk about mineral deficiencies. And so this is something that we have to think about as a subclinical problem, because often when they get to the clinical case, that's where we actually see signs. It's kind of too late in some of these issues. And so we see over here in the subclinical part, compared with intake, we really start to see some of that loss of immune function and some of those traits that we look for, growth and reproduction and lactation. We see that, we don't see it physically, but there is an impact on those things before we actually see physical symptoms. And so if our minerals are not sufficient in the diet, we're losing some performance that we don't even realize. And that can have a negative impact down the road or collectively as we add that up over our whole herd. So subclinically, we're going to have lower reproduction rates. If we have stressed calves or weaned calves, have a higher rate of those that have to be pulled and treated for health problems, and a lower growth rate for those. And so it's really difficult to identify if there are problems without proper records. So making sure that we know what our calf crop is from year to year, or kind of know which animals are getting sick more often. And if we have those to look back on and we know what our mineral program was, we can start to tie those two together to figure out kind of where the issue is. So once we get into some clinical issues, I just want to name a couple that we might see. The first one is poloencephalomalacia, PEM or polio. And this is going to be a neurological disease. And this is a problem when there's high sulfur in the diet. And so the total diet really is just a very small percent. We want less than 0.3% of sulfur in the diet. And that's going to be from all components of the diet. So water, feed, forages. And at 0.3% is when it starts to really influence copper uptake. And then at 0.5%, it can cause death. So not a very huge difference there between 0.3 and 0.5%. And we can get a pretty large negative impact pretty quickly. So thinking about distillers grains is a really common ingredient that is high in sulfur. That has to do with the way that it's processed after it's gone through the ethanol process. And so if you're feeding a diet that is high in distillers grains, then make sure that you're keeping an eye on those sulfur levels, and then also the sulfur that may be in the water. Another issue that we see is water belly or urinary calculi. This is basically urinary stones or kidney stones, and so, or excuse me, bladder stones. And so this is going to be an issue if there's not enough calcium in the diet. So an inadequate calcium to phosphorus ratio. We want that ratio to be 2 to 1. So we want 2 parts of calcium for every 1 part of phosphorus. It can even be higher than that, but we certainly don't want it to be lower than that. And so if you remember all the way back to that slide I showed you about where we get minerals in the diet, you'll remember that calcium was high in forages and it is low in grain, and phosphorus is high in grain and low in forages. And so when we see cattle on a forage-based diet, their calcium to phosphorus ratio is typically sufficient. It is where it needs to be because those forages have more calcium than they do phosphorus. When they're on a grain-based diet, that ratio is flipped. So there's a lot more phosphorus in the diet, the more grains that they're eating, so the more corn, and there's less calcium in that corn. And so really thinking about folks that are grain finishing on farm, especially in these smaller settings, it's hard to get some of those ratios to be right because we're not mixing large amounts of feed. So if you're finishing on farm or feeding grain-based diets, make sure that you have a calcium source that is in the feed to offset that phosphorus that's there. Another deficiency we see is selenium. If you look at this map here, you all are in the area that says that selenium is too low for farm animals. We're kind of in that middle ground here in Tennessee where the case could be that it's adequate or it could be that it's too low. And so we want to make sure that we're providing that selenium in the diet because we don't want to have negative impacts on our adult cattle, which really impact some of their reproductive and lactation traits. And then in our young cattle, if you've ever heard of white muscle disease, that is a problem that is selenium deficiency. So that calf cannot get up. It's very weak. It may even die very early if it doesn't have enough selenium, and it can't get up to nurse right away. And so we want to make sure that we have plenty of selenium in the diet, but selenium is the one mineral that is regulated because it can be toxic at pretty low levels. So there needs to be some selenium in your mineral product, but can't overfeed that because you want to make sure that it doesn't get into the toxic range. And the last clinical issue I'll mention is grass tetany. So grass tetany occurs when there are high amounts of potassium in the diet and low amounts of magnesium. So thinking back to those mineral interactions again. And this is really prevalent when our spring forages really jump in growth. So they're in that very quick vegetative stage. They're growing rapidly. It's started to warm up a little bit, but it's not gotten hot yet. So right there in the spring, maybe we fertilized our cool season forages and they're growing very, very, very quickly. And that dilutes out the amount of magnesium that's available in that forage. And so thinking about most specifically the animals that are in pre or early lactation, because they're pulling these minerals from their body stores to provide milk for their calf, they really are at risk for having grass tetany issues. And so when we know that our cows are getting ready to calve, about a month before that, if we start providing a high mag mineral, which would be something like 10 to 14% magnesium rather than 3 or 4, which we would typically see in a mineral, that's going to help offset that lower magnesium that's in the diet. And this is something that's easily prevented if we do provide that high mag mineral. I talked with our extension veterinarian here at UT, and he said in the 20 years that he has worked, he's never seen a case of grass tetany, but he writes about it every single spring to make sure that people know to put out high mag mineral. And typically he doesn't see a lot of issues with it. So it can happen, but certainly we can prevent it if we provide the appropriate mineral supplements. All right, I mentioned that we would talk about costs, and we're going to do them really fast. So this is just a quick table that was thrown together to compare some different types of supplementation, ranging from the cheapest, which would be a white salt block, which, as you know now, is not a complete source of minerals. And it's obviously going to be the least expensive because it doesn't provide that mineral nutrition that we're looking for. And then as they start to get more complex, so trace mineralized salt in the block form, trace mineralized salt in the loose form, and then we actually start seeing those complete minerals that have the macro minerals in them, either in an inorganic or an organic form, we see that cost start to go up. And so if you look at, $7 versus $35 on those individual supplements, there's a pretty big difference there. If we take into account the daily intake and whether or not specifically here selenium is adequate, and that's because we're looking at a mineral that has an organic or more available selenium, you do see a pretty big difference in annual cost per cow. So $5 a cow versus $45 a cow, that can add up depending on how many animals you have. But if we think about current prices, I looked these up for your area of the US, and a 750-pound feeder steer was $1,100 in the past month or so. A 1,350-pound cull cow was $1,150. And so if we take into account the fact that, we're spending $40 and potentially getting that $1,150 back, then that starts to pencil out. And so we don't want to skimp on these areas that can have, negative effects on all of their performance. So if we think about a cow that's not getting her proper nutrition, she's not getting enough minerals or vitamins, then she's not going to produce a calf. She's not going to, to thrive or be healthy. And so if we lose her to death, or we don't get a calf out of her, then we're losing that benefit or that income that we would have from her anyway. So, let's go ahead and spend the amount of money that it takes to get a proper mineral supplement, even though, it may cost more than something as simple as plain white salt, because it ends up paying when we have a good product at the end of the day, whether that is a weaned calf or, a finished calf. So I want to wrap up here. It's important to read labels and compare products, knowing that there's differences in bioavailability, there's differences in concentrations of nutrients. And so thinking about the diet that your cattle currently has, what's available to it, and then, whether it's especially forage or grain-based, and comparing those products and making the right choice for your management style. And we can avoid a lot of these deficiencies and any loss in performance by making sure that we supply a complete mineral. So one that includes macrominerals, calcium, phosphorus, those big ones we talked about, as well as trace minerals all year. So we want to have it out there year round so that we can supply these nutrients and not count on their diet to supply them for us. With that, just a quick resource, if you're interested in looking at our mineral publication here at UT, this is a little bit dated now. It needs to be updated, but it's got some pretty neat information in there about a mineral survey that was done several years ago, looking at the mineral status of our forages and our soil and how that impacts animal performance, and then also mineral programs. And so that's on our website. Our website is utbeef.com. You're certainly welcome to get in touch with me if you have any questions about tonight's presentation. And I've got my phone number and my email there. And I'd also take any questions now if you have them.